If you're anything like me, you might be paying upwards of $30,000 a year for your family plan. Meanwhile, you go get prescribed a GLP-1 and your insurance says no. So you go to the pharmacy says, yeah, we can fill it for you, but it's going to be $500. And guess what? It's not going to count towards your deductible. You're already paying into this broken system exorbitant amounts of money. And now you're paying again outside the system. Meanwhile, some crazy things are happening. Congress just majorly regulated the middlemen, the PBMs. The FDA may be restricting compound semaglutide. Walgreens just launched a direct cash GLP-1 clinic. Amazon's kind of doing the same thing. And AI just designed a brand new obesity drug that's entering phase 3. If this all feels like super chaotic, it's because the healthcare system, the entire healthcare system as we know it, is reorganizing itself in real time. And patients, of course, are caught in the middle. And we're going to break it all down on this week's episode of the Weekly Dose Podcast. Welcome back.
Welcome to the On the Pen Podcast with your host, Dave Knapp.
Welcome back to this week's edition of On the Pen, the Weekly Dose Podcast. I'm your host, Dave Knapp, man on the Manjaro. That's why I'm here. You are on the pen. Wegovy, Saxenda, Victoza, Trulicity, Manjaro, Zepbound, Compound. That pen is what we talk about each and every week here at OTP. We're super glad to have you back. This is going to be an amazing episode. But before we get started, I want to thank our sponsor, Shed. They bring the podcast to us each and every week. And if you're not familiar with Shed, if you're the type of person who's living with the disease of obesity and you felt flat out shut out by the system we're going to take down today in this week's news, then you need to look no further than Shed, because they're a great option if you are looking for treatment. Get connected with a provider who's going to hear you, who's going to take a look at your medical issues, and then connect you with the prescriptions that might be beneficial to treating the chronic disease of obesity for you. They've got different options for everyone. I hope that you'll check them out. And if you use code OTP25, you're going to save 25%. Make sure you let Shed know that you came from OTP and let them know that you appreciate them helping to bring the news each and every week. And this week is wild. I mean, I feel like I say that every week. It has been such an amazing thing to watch this space expand in real time over the last couple of years. But we're going to lay out everything that we talked about in the open today, because there's so much going on in Washington in particular on a policy level. So you may have heard of HR 7148. This is the Lowering Prescription Drug Costs Act. And I want to lay out what this is and why it matters or should matter to you. It passed Congress as part of the 2026 appropriations package. It means that both chambers of the House have approved it, but it only becomes law when the full spending package is signed by the president. Once this is enacted, most provisions take effect roughly 30 months later. So for the calendar year plans that this might affect, it means January 1st of probably 2029. So this is coming, but it will be phased. Now, what does it do? And why should you care? So the changes that were made to PBMs through this legislation are huge. There is this first thing called the 100% rebate pass-through. So PBMs have to remit all the rebates and manufacturer payments to the health plan. No more sort of quietly keeping a slice of that pie. Now, if you don't know how all this works, there's basically a list price for a drug. And that's sort of what we hear bantied about on Capitol Hill. We pay 10 times what they pay in this country. That's the list price. Very few people in the United States actually pay the list price, but we're ultimately paying for it, if you know what I mean, in the form of exorbitantly high drug costs, right? And so what happens here is the drug companies, they come out with a list price. That's this top tier, which basically starts the negotiations off with the pharmacy benefit managers. The pharmacy benefit managers sort of act as this intermediary between the patients and the drug companies, and they basically gatekeep access to various medications that are allowed onto their formulary. So in other words, they say, we need a diabetes medication. Let's go to all the companies that make diabetes medications, and let's tell them how much we want to make off of each diabetes medication that is prescribed. And so they work out these deals. And so the manufacturers inflate their list price to account for the fact that much of that inflated costs. Up to 80% of that cost may be going back to the PBMs. And up until this legislation, the PBMs could keep sort of as much of that as they wanted. Some of it might be remitted back to the plan or the employer to help reduce their overall cost. But oftentimes the PBMs were taking a huge cut of that. And so this 100% rebate pass-through means that PBMs now have to remit all of that rebate that they negotiate off the list price back to the health plan, which should theoretically lower the cost of health plans. Whether it does that in reality or not, it remains to be seen. It seems like there's always enough hands to kind of get their in the hands in the pot and take it before it actually makes its way back to patients. Then there's this drug by transparency. So plans get detailed reporting on spending, rebates, and participant drug cost sharing, which helps to increase some transparency in the process. There's a spread pricing initiative that basically is indicated to show you the difference between what the PBM plan actually is charged and what they pay the pharmacies. That all has to be disclosed. So the difference between what PBMs charge the plans and what they pay the pharmacies has to be disclosed, because oftentimes they're rebating the pharmacy less money than the plan is getting charged, if you can believe that. And so just kind of brings some balance there. And then audit rights. Employers can inspect contracts and verify compensation structures. So this is structural reform to PBMs. It doesn't abolish them or get rid of them. You have to have somebody who's sort of managing this, right? But it puts more guardrails around them. This is not going to lower GLP-1 prices tomorrow, but it's going to change the incentives in a massive way. And the incentives are what drive pricing behavior in this whole prescription drug market. Now, let's layer this on top. So we're talking about accessibility and affordability of GLP-1 medications within the confines of the conversations that we have here. Reuters reported this past week that industry experts believe that the FDA could be moving to add semaglutide to their demonstrably difficult to compound list. Now, if you've been following On the Pen, you already know what that means. But essentially, the DDC list is a list of drugs that are not allowed to be compounded, basically, because they're too difficult to be compounded. And both Novo Nordisk and Eli Lilly have been moving in the direction of trying to get their both tirzepatide and semaglutide, respectively, added to this DDC list. Now, Reuters reported this past week that industry experts, two of them specifically, believe that the FDA could do this with semaglutide. And so if this happens, compound semaglutide access would tighten significantly. Now, this all comes in the wake of what we covered in the podcast last week, that the list prices of Ozempic are going to be reduced in half, or the list price of semaglutide in general by about 50% across the board starting next year. But again, that's the list price. That's the starting negotiating price between the PBMs and the drug manufacturers. It might not actually make its way in savings back down to patients, which is, again, what this bill is trying to pull at the threads of this convoluted sort of process that just leaves patients ultimately paying more money. But to this specific topic about Reuters and the DDC list, this is another area of accessibility, whether it's intended or not. It does open up a lane of affordability for patients who are able to get compounded semaglutide. And so we're seeing potential regulatory action happening to squeeze that out. And again, Lilly's doing the same thing. So when we zoom out on this sort of policy issue, we've got federal law reforming pharmacy benefit managers, which is a good thing. But how much of that makes its way back to patients is the big question mark. We have regulators potentially restricting compounding. And then we have state and federal oversight of compound tightening too. There's bills popping up. We had Sabina from GLP Winner on last week, basically trying to thwart compounding at every level, at the state level, at the federal level. We're seeing all over the map. So Washington is clearly wielding its power to shape access to GLP-1 medications. This is not about market dynamics right now. This is about policy architecture that's going to determine in the future who gets coverage and who does not. And we're going to, of course, continue to follow it closely here at On the Pen, as we always have, because policy ultimately determines who gets treated and who gets left out, or who pays more and who pays less. And so these are all important things when it comes to the topic of accessibility. And you can count on us to get that. That's why I would ask you to take one moment out of your day. If you're watching on YouTube, to hit the hype button down below. You can find that by hitting the description of the video. And there's a little button in there that says hype. Just hit hype. You can do it up to 3 times. That will help other people get this message. As it gets hyped, it gets pushed out by the algorithm a little bit more. So hit the hype button and let us know in the comments that you did it. If you're listening on the podcast, a 5-star rating and review helps us get out to more people too. And we rely on you all to help spread the word of what we're doing at On the Pen as we continue to cover all of these things that shape future access to obesity care and obesity treatment. Now, here's where I've been trying to articulate this for months now. Patients are living in a very weird world right now, and specifically GLP-1 patients. And I realize that that's an ever-growing number of people, but we've lived a very weird reality of the healthcare system. There's 2 different healthcare systems sort of happening in parallel with each other. So I want to tell you the story here that's happened this week. We've seen Walgreens launch a virtual weight management clinic. Now, they're offering like a $49 visit with no subscription, and then they can push you to the self-pay GLP-1 prescription options. So you like Wegovy injectable, the Wegovy pills that I believe are around $149 to start. And then of course you've got Lilly Direct in there and the Zepbound products that are starting at around $349 a month. They're not alone here. Walgreens is not alone. Amazon is doing something similar direct to consumer, refilling GLP-1s, offering telehealth consults, offering transparent pricing. Retail and tech are building this sort of parallel lane to our healthcare system. Why? Well, because more than half of large employers still do not cover GLP-1 medications for obesity. And now the patient reality is looking like this. You either pay $20,000 or $30,000 a year for your family plan and premiums like we do, for your, or, you know, you may have an employer sponsored plan that pays a little bit more of that and you don't have to pay quite as much, but that's the cost to our healthcare system. The deductibles are resetting every January, and coinsurance continues on like it always does. So you're still paying out of pocket. And when your doctor prescribes a GLP-1 for obesity, what happens? Your insurance denies it. So what happens? You go to, you know, like our friends over at Claimable and see if they'll help you win that. But even that, you know, 50-50 shot maybe at getting coverage. So where do you go? Well, you go to this parallel cash pay direct to consumer healthcare economy that has taken shape over the last year or two. And you buy outside of the normal healthcare system where you're spending exorbitant amounts of money on these plans. And then the cost of the medication doesn't even count towards your deductible. It doesn't reduce your out-of-pocket maximum. It makes you healthier. It makes you less likely to have a heart attack, less likely to have a stroke, less likely to have sleep apnea symptoms, less likely to get many different types of cancers. So it makes you cheaper to insure. But are we seeing that on the back end with the cost of our insurance premiums? Absolutely not. And so this tension that we're living in as patients living with obesity and trying to get access to these medications is extremely exhausting. And now this past week, RFK Jr. was on the Joe Rogan podcast. Now, the main storyline to come out of this, and we did cover it here on one of our lives at On the Pen. We're live every Monday, Wednesday, Friday at 11 a.m. Central Time. There was this big announcement that they're moving 14 of the 19 peptides that are category 2 to category 1, which effectively means compound pharmacies will be able to make these peptides like BPC 157 or some of these other peptides that people are interested in, basically for longevity, not FDA approved necessarily, but could now be prescribed once this happens off label by a prescriber and fulfilled by a compound pharmacy. They can't while they're on category 2. That's why everybody goes to the gray market for this stuff. So Robert F. Kennedy was on Rogan and he spoke actually a little to this kind of frustration that we're living in. And I want you to, we're not talking politics, however, we're talking about the Health and Human Services Secretary. And I find what he had to say interesting for us to discuss here. He argued that the healthcare system currently rewards volume and chronic disease spending rather than prevention. And in the middlemen, the PBMs are extracting a ton of that value, basically arguing that incentives are misaligned. Now, whether you agree with his broader political framework or not, the frustration he's describing is real, because patients really feel trapped. So this system is splitting. You've got the cash pay over here, you've got the insurance model over here, and really, I think the shift is a positive one. But you have patients who may be expanding accessibility, but there's still a lot of people who are left out in the cold at $400 a month. It feels like a very exclusionary or sort of like Cadillac option to be offered these branded medications. And this is the dichotomy that we've been trying to talk about here at On the Pen, because you have many people who are simply being forced to the compound market or forced to the gray market, because the compound market is being squeezed. We talked a little bit about that earlier. You see, even with the next generation of obesity medicines, you see things like retatrutide, which you see Eli Lilly right now in active litigation against the FDA to get it categorized as a biologic so that it can never be compounded. So these are just amazing. And then on top of that, what I'm getting notifications for right now is all of the letters that we reported on about 2 weeks ago that went out to the FDA to different telehealth companies are now available on the FDA website. The FDA sent out some 20 some letters all in one day to different telehealth companies, basically, putting them on warning, right? And so you see this squeezing of the compound market. Now you see so many folks moving to the gray market, and they oftentimes have no choice. We actually have a interview that we did with a gentleman named Ben, who was forced to the gray market in order to get a knee surgery. And we tell his story. I'm going to bring that to you in the coming days. But these are real patients with real issues that are being forced to make really tough decisions about their health, because we're living in this weird dichotomy right now. Now, this is something that we're going to continue to highlight it on the Pen, because I think there's a lot of people who live in the community of people with obesity who have felt less than because they've been pushed to these alternatives. And I want to include their stories too. So we'll continue to cover that, because I think it's important that their stories are told too along the way, because they're having to make really tough decisions because this system is really broken. And what's happening right now is patients are living right in the middle of this sort of evolution of healthcare. Will it be better? Time will tell. But right now there is expanding access to GLP-1s, but many, many, many people still left on the fringes. Now let's zoom to another topic, maybe a little bit more intriguing and less frustrating. Beat your head into the wall. This is a crazy story. When we talk about the shaping of the future of obesity medicine, we have to talk about AI and we have to talk about innovation. Now, this is super interesting. A company called MindRank just dosed the first patient in a phase 3 clinical trial for a drug called, of course, it's a lame name, MDR for MindRank. MDR-001. It is an oral small molecule GLP-1. Think orforglipron, right? A small molecule non-peptide. It's a GLP-1 receptor agonist, and it was designed using AI. So from project start to investigational clearance, that's like the day that they conceived the idea, to actually getting the green light to run this through clinical trials, it only took 19 months, a process that used to take years and years and years. That's super fast. And so for MDR-001, the small molecule oral GLP-1, it's now entering phase 3. The trial's called the MOBILE trial, MOBILE, and it's including around 750 patients in 50 clinical centers in China. It's a randomized double-blind placebo-controlled study. Earlier this year, it showed meaningful efficacy and favorable tolerability. Again, this is a Chinese company developing this with AI. 19 months from conception to regulatory clearance. That is a super fast track, and just gives you a little bit of an idea of how fast things are moving with AI. Now, I think it's interesting to sort of juxtapose this to some of the things we've heard from Dave Ricks, the CEO of Eli Lilly, who's actually leading sort of leading the charge for advancement in obesity medicine, leading the largest company in this space and one of the largest companies in the world at this point, in Eli Lilly. Now, this is what he recently had to say about AI and advancements in biology, et cetera, because they're putting a ton of money over at Lilly into advancements in AI, opening up a new AI supercomputers within the Lilly offices in Indiana. It's just fascinating to kind of see this all take shape. They've partnered with different AI companies to help in drug development. This is what Dave Ricks had to say on a podcast this past week. He walked through basically the origin story of GLP-1 beginning in the 1970s with the discovery of the incretin effect and these nutrient stimulated hormones. You eat, you make these hormones. These hormones last for a few minutes in your body, but they signal all sorts of things in your body. Talked about the Gila monster and the venom in the peptide that exists within that venom called exenatide, which was developed into Byetta, which was the first twice daily GLP-1. Anyway, early on, with the injections, you had tons of nausea, tons of peaks and troughs because very short half-life. And it was engineered over time to last longer and to flatten the drug curve, which ultimately led to drugs like, eventually liraglutide from Novo Nordisk, and then dulaglutide, the first once weekly, which is Trulicity from Eli Lilly. And then kind of building on Trulicity and building on liraglutide, you had Semaglutide, which is Ozempic and Wegovy. Anyway, y'all know the origin story. But, taking it from basically this potential molecule in a Gila monster venom all the way to what we have today in a drug called tirzepatide. And so you have basically the very early 2000s when, 2006, when the Gila monster peptide was identified, to 2019 when we have a drug like tirzepatide introduced to the market. So you have decades of iterations in there. And Rick said something that was super interesting. AI models are trained on language, not the complexity of biology and chemistry. So basically predicting protein structure is impressive, but it's one piece of like 1,000-piece puzzle. And he said something interesting, that we're still toddlers when it comes to the language of biology. So both things can sort of hold true at the same time. AI can accelerate molecule discovery, but biology still ultimately governs the outcome. So these clinical trials are going to be hugely important in terms of long-term safety, in terms of different outcomes of these medications. The algorithm does not override physiology. And so these models are going to have to be trained to really speak the language of chemistry and of biology in a way that humans have only begun to tap into. And so that's sort of the challenge with AI and drug development right now, as per Dave Ricks, the CEO of Eli Lilly. So I thought that was a fascinating conversation. It was over on the Plain English podcast. If you want to check it out, we're trying to work on getting Dave Ricks to the On the Pen podcast. So let me know in the comments if you would be interested to hear that, because Lilly's working on making a decision right now as we speak. And so we hope that he would come on to the podcast here and share more directly with the community. I think you all would let me hear some of the questions that you would have for him in the comments of the video. I'd love to hear from you. Hopefully we can get him on. But you can see this overarching story here about access. It's all of the structural pressure that we're facing. You've got government completely reshaping pricing incentives. You've got regulators out there that are every day tightening the screws harder and harder and harder on the compounding world. And then you have this sort of retail direct to consumer healthcare economy that's sprouting up in real time. We've got AI accelerating discovery happening on top of all that. And patients now are just, again, we're just caught in the middle of all this friction. But we're going to continue to bring you the noise here, or the news here, so that you can turn down the noise of everything that's happening and actually know what is going on, why is it going on, so that you're empowered to have better conversations with your doctor. Because at the end of the day, that is what we exist to do here. We exist to empower you with information each and every week that you can then take to your doctor and go, hey, have you seen this? Have you heard about this? What do you think about this for me? Or what are we going to do if this is the way that things happen, so that you can just plan with your doctor and have better outcomes. So if all of that is important to you, my ask is simply that you'd hit the hype button below if you're watching on YouTube, hit the thumbs up button, drop us a comment. And if you're listening on the podcast, please, a 5-star rating and review goes so far in helping to push our podcast out through the Apple algorithm. We're consistently in the top 20 of U.S. medical podcasts. We have about 415 reviews on the podcast right now. I would love to get that to 500. There are thousands and thousands of you that listen each and every week. If you find this podcast helpful in any way, please leave it a 5-star review. You just have to scroll down on the podcast screen until you see the stars, tap 5, and then you get extra credit if you leave us a little note and let us know what you think of the podcast. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for being the best part of what we do at On the Pen. Don't forget that we're live every Monday, Wednesday, Friday at 11 a.m. on YouTube. We're working on getting this live show on the airwaves. So many things, exciting things are happening and coming to On the Pen this year. We love that you're a part of it. Can't wait to do it with you, and we'll catch you on the next one.